Welcome back, lovely ladies. If you want to become the woman of your dreams, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. And join our Patreon for even more exclusive content. Now, let's dive into today's story.
Joseph squinted at the piece of paper in his hand as the midday sun cast a gentle glow across his grandmother's front porch. The chipped paint, the worn swing, and the wicker chairs seemed to have witnessed a century of heartfelt conversations. He ran a wrinkled hand through his thinning salt and pepper hair, unsure whether he wanted to chuckle or stare in disbelief at what he was reading. The paper listed details of a local baking competition, one that had unexpectedly become the center of his grandmother's latest grand plan. "I can't believe you're serious about this," Joseph said, his voice tinged with both awe and amusement. His grandmother, Lorraine, sat with her spine straight as an iron rod, her weathered hands folded primly on her lap. Her silver hair was curled neatly, and her bright blue eyes sparkled with mischief. She had always been a force of nature, known throughout their family for her relentless optimism. The lines around her mouth hinted at a lifetime of smiles. Despite her advanced years, she had a timeless energy that radiated with every word. "Of course I'm serious," she replied. "This competition is my dream. I'd go in myself if I had the stamina, but at my age, standing for hours in a hot kitchen is no easy task." She gave him a steady look. "That's why I need you." Joseph frowned, folding the paper. The contest, the Culinary Stars Showcase, was a prestigious event. The description said that many of the finalists were women, so it had gained a reputation for being a mostly female-dominated affair. Lorraine's plan? Have Joseph enter, but as someone else, namely, as a woman. "It's not just about the competition, is it?" Joseph asked, stretching his legs out across the porch's old wooden boards. Lorraine gave a small shrug. "You've been cooped up in that house alone for too long, dear. It's time you found a spark again. You used to talk about opening a bakery with your wife. You two had so many dreams." Her voice softened. "You might find something worth pursuing if you give this a shot." He had lost his wife, Cynthia, nearly 5 years ago. The ache of her absence never completely faded, although the intensity of his grief had softened over time. Baking once held a deep significance to him. It was the passion he had shared with Cynthia. Yet after she passed, he put his cherished rolling pins and mixing bowls away. His grandmother's plan felt preposterous, but perhaps it was also the nudge he needed. Joseph cleared his throat. "Grandma, you do realize this is unconventional." Lorraine sat up straight, her gaze unwavering. "Sometimes to get what you want, you do something bold. If that means you dress up like a lady, so be it." He gave a silent nod and stuffed the flyer in his pocket. He loved Lorraine too much to outright refuse. Besides, a part of him was curious about whether he still had that flair for baking. They sat there in companionable silence, the porch swing squeaking softly. It had been months since Joseph felt a flutter of excitement about anything in life, so maybe Lorraine had stumbled onto something greater than just a silly plan. "All right," Joseph said at last, though his voice was reluctant. "Tell me how you imagine this scheme working." Lorraine's eyes lit up, as though she had been waiting for that question all day. "We'll work on your presentation, that's how. You won't do anything dramatic with your face. Just some subtle touches. I have an old wardrobe that might fit you well enough if we do some adjustments. Oh, I'll teach you posture and a bit of grace. You were always a gentleman, so how hard can it be to let out that gentleness in a different way?" Joseph felt his ears grow warm. "Grandma, you make it sound so easy. I'm a 62-year-old man. This entire idea sounds ridiculous." She chuckled warmly. "You might feel silly at first, but trust me, once you get lost in the baking, you'll forget all about the outfit." Joseph let out a slow exhale and gave a small nod. I can't believe I'm agreeing to this. Lorraine reached over and patted his hand. Thank you. We'll start tomorrow morning. He rose from the creaky rocking chair, the floorboards moaning under his weight, and gave his grandmother a kiss on the cheek before heading home. That evening, as he lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, memories of Cynthia drifting through his mind. He recalled how they would team up for every holiday to create confections that dazzled guests. Perhaps stepping into that world again, no matter how bizarre the method, might bring back a piece of what he missed. Early the next day, Joseph returned to Lorraine's house, steeling himself for whatever transformation she had planned. She ushered him into her living room, which had been turned into an impromptu wardrobe station. A tall mirror stood in front of the couch. Stacks of old dresses, skirts, blouses, and accessories were strewn about. Joseph let out a slow whistle as he assessed the situation. I feel like I'm entering a theatrical costume department, he said, trying to keep his tone light. Lorraine chuckled. We'll find something that's not too flashy but still presentable for a competition. We don't want to draw suspicion, but we also want you to blend in naturally. And we can't ignore that the competition has a certain style. You need to look the part. They spent much of the morning sifting through fabrics and patterns. The first dress Lorraine handed him was a floral knee-length number with short sleeves, reminiscent of something one might wear to a garden party. He held it at arm's length, stammering for a moment at the thought of actually wearing it. Go on, she insisted, giving him a supportive pat on the shoulder. You can change in the bathroom. Taking a measured breath, Joseph retreated to the bathroom. He gingerly pulled off his shirt and pants and slipped into the dress. The material felt strange against his skin, softer, lighter. He gazed at his reflection and hardly recognized himself. He didn't see an obvious woman, but the silhouette was different enough that it startled him. With a determined set to his jaw, he returned to the living room. Lorraine studied him, her eyes bright with a combination of kindness and amusement. Not bad, she declared, but we'll need a wig. Joseph's eyebrows shot up. A wig? Yes, dear, a wig. Let's not forget the bigger picture. You have short hair, and though you do have a gentle face, you'll need a bit more help. She rummaged through a box in the corner. I borrowed this from one of my friends who used to be involved in local theater productions. It's a neat little bob, and it should work with your face shape. She placed the wig on his head, adjusting the strands carefully. The hair was dark gray, with a subtle wave, so it didn't look artificially young. Joseph turned to the mirror once more. The effect was remarkable. He went from looking like a man in a dress to someone whose appearance might genuinely pass as a dignified older woman under the right lighting and subtle cosmetics. Lorraine circled him. See? When you stand up straight, keep your chin slightly tilted. It's quite believable. Now we'll just do a quick practice with posture, mannerisms, and some discreet makeup. Joseph let out a low groan, but didn't protest. Over the next hour, Lorraine guided him through steps that initially felt ridiculous. Lighter footsteps, modest gestures, a softer voice. He stumbled through it, feeling more embarrassed than he had in decades, but he persevered. At one point, Lorraine used a gentle touch of foundation and a bit of lipstick. Nothing garish, just enough to soften the edges of his features. When Lorraine stepped back, her eyes turned serious. We'll call you Josie. That was my sister's name. I always admired her, and it fits you. The corner of Joseph's mouth twitched. Josie, he repeated under his breath. It felt odd, but he decided not to argue. After all, he was already knee-deep in this elaborate plan. For the next 2 weeks, they drilled daily. During the day, Joseph practiced the recipes he once knew by heart, from classic pound cakes to elaborate pastries. He found that despite his hiatus, the techniques came back quickly, like a pianist returning to a beloved tune. Flour dusted his apron, and an excited tension filled the kitchen. Every so often, Lorraine would pop in to correct his stance or remind him to keep his voice at a certain pitch. The repeated practice paid off. By the end of that period, Joseph could walk in small heels for short stretches without stumbling, and he could shape a consistent pie crust in record time. One afternoon, as they took a break to taste test a batch of ginger cookies, Lorraine studied Joseph. "Have you been sleeping any better?" she asked softly. Joseph paused, cookie halfway to his mouth. He considered the question. Over the last few years, sleepless nights had weighed heavily on him, haunted by the emptiness of the house he once shared with Cynthia. Lately, though, with his mind focused on the upcoming competition and perfecting his technique, he had found a new routine. That deep sadness was still there, but there was also something else, something close to a sense of purpose. He offered a small nod. "I've been doing all right, Grandma." She smiled. "I'm glad. I really do believe this is good for you." He reached for another cookie, deciding not to dwell too long on that uncertain feeling. In a week's time, Josie would make her official debut at the Culinary Stars Showcase's registration booth. On the day they headed to the community center to sign up, Joseph felt sweat trickling down his back, even in the air-conditioned hallway. He wore a simple pink blouse tucked into a knee-length skirt with sensible shoes, nothing flashy. The wig fit snugly, and a light dusting of blush kept his cheeks looking warm. Lorraine had insisted he at least wear a pair of earrings, clip-ons that pinched uncomfortably, but they added to the overall impression. They approached the registration table, where a cheerful woman in her 40s was typing away at a laptop. A banner read, "Culinary Stars Showcase Registration, New Participants Welcome." Joseph's heart pounded. He made sure to keep his voice calm. "Hello," he said, clearing his throat to ensure it came out more softly. "I'm here to register." "Lovely," chirped the woman, looking him up and down briefly. "Your name, please?" He swallowed. Josie Hamilton." With a welcoming grin, the woman typed in the details. As Joseph rattled off the necessary information, Lorraine stood behind him, a hand on his shoulder for reassurance. Before he knew it, the woman handed him a pamphlet outlining the contest rules and a lanyard with a badge labeled "Josie Hamilton, Contestant." A wave of relief swept through him. No one had given him a suspicious look, nor had they questioned him. The ruse was holding together. "Welcome, Miss Hamilton," said the woman at the desk. "We're so happy to have you join us. You can attend the orientation session in the auditorium next door. Good luck in the competition." Joseph managed a gracious nod. "Thank you." He and Lorraine made their way down the hallway, finding seats among a crowd of eager contestants. Dozens of folks were chatting excitedly. Most were women in their 40s, 50s, and a few well into their 60s or 70s, along with some men scattered throughout. Joseph tried to blend in, feigning the poise that Lorraine had coached him on. He found a spot near the front so he could hear the instructions. An official from the organizing committee took the stage, explaining how the contest would unfold. Participants would face weekly challenges, and after each round, a certain number would be eliminated until they reached the final. Joseph's nerves flickered, but excitement rose in him at the same time. He used to dream of events like this back in his younger days. It felt surreal to be here now, under such unusual circumstances. Toward the end of the orientation, a woman with a soft expression and silver hair a shade lighter than Joseph's came to sit next to him. She smiled, her warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners. She wore a floral dress that complemented her figure, and her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Something about her aura made Joseph's tense shoulders relax. "Hello," she greeted. "I'm Margaret." Joseph extended his hand, careful to keep it graceful. "Josie, it's nice to meet you." She studied him with a curious tilt of her head. Is this your first time in a contest like this? He offered a small shrug. It is, actually. Margaret nodded. It's my first as well. I've always been fond of baking. My late husband and I used to make pies together every weekend, but I never had the courage to compete until now. I promised myself I'd be bold this year. Joseph felt a twinge in his chest at her mention of a late spouse, but also a sense of solidarity. He forced a calm smile. Sometimes these opportunities arrive at just the right moment. She gave him a gentle laugh. I suppose so. I'm a bit nervous, if I'm honest. Joseph allowed himself a soft chuckle, though he kept his tone a touch higher. Nerves mean you care about it. We'll both do our best. The conversation with Margaret soothed him. Her sincerity, the way she spoke of her experiences, reminded Joseph of the quiet warmth Cynthia once possessed. Despite the unconventional circumstances, Joseph felt a spark of camaraderie. Lorraine caught his eye from across the room and offered him a cheerful thumbs up. Once the orientation ended, Joseph offered Margaret a polite goodbye, then headed out with Lorraine. In the hallway, she gave him a playful nudge. I saw you talking with that lovely woman. You seemed at ease. Grandma, he said with a faint smile. She was just being friendly. Friendly is good, Lorraine teased with a wink. You need more of that in your life. Joseph shook his head, but couldn't deny feeling just a little lighter. The competition kicked off the following Saturday. Joseph found himself standing behind a stainless steel station in a huge commercial kitchen, cameras set up in corners to capture the action for the local broadcast. Each contestant had their own space, complete with a countertop mixer, a selection of bowls, and a set of utensils. Dozens of participants bustled about, tying aprons and arranging ingredients. The show host, a tall man with slicked back hair, gave a flashy grin as he welcomed everyone. Good morning, bakers. Today's challenge is an old-fashioned staple with a twist. You'll each create your favorite family recipe cake, but you must incorporate a regional ingredient that we've provided. A cart carrying a variety of produce and specialty items was wheeled out. Joseph found himself with a batch of local peaches, ripe, fragrant, and perfect for a cobbler or jam. He decided he would fold them into the topping for a classic pound cake, the same recipe he had once perfected alongside Cynthia. His hands trembled slightly at first, but once he started measuring the flour and sugar, his focus narrowed to the delicate art he knew so well. He felt the sweet smell of butter mixing with sugar fill the air, transporting him back years in time. Despite the wig and the dress, he felt oddly at home behind that mixing bowl. No one seemed to be paying attention to whether Josie was truly a woman or not. Everyone was engrossed in their own creations. Margaret was 2 stations over, working on a lemon drizzle cake with fresh herbs from the cart. They exchanged a quick smile in the midst of the hectic environment. It gave Joseph a quiet sense of reassurance. As the hours passed, the kitchen grew hotter and busier. Whisks whirred, ovens hummed, and the tension mounted. Joseph poured his batter into a round tin and set it in the oven, then carefully prepared a peach topping to simmer on the stove until it turned into a thick glaze. By the time the production staff signaled the final 15 minutes, he was layering the peaches over the cake and garnishing it with a sprinkle of finely chopped walnuts. When time was called, the judges made their rounds, sampling each offering. Joseph steeled himself as 3 distinguished-looking judges approached, one middle-aged man who was a local chef, and 2 women known for their dessert cookbooks. They asked for the name of his dish. It's a classic pound cake, he explained in a measured tone. I added a peach topping and a walnut garnish. The peaches are from the local orchard. One judge took a bite and closed her eyes momentarily. The cake is wonderfully moist, and the peaches add a fresh sweetness, she commented. Another judge nodded, turning to Joseph. Did you use almond extract in the batter? Joseph offered a small smile. Yes, Just a teaspoon. I think it complements the peaches." They gave him approving nods before moving on. He stood still, heart pounding, but a sense of accomplishment glowed in his chest. He had made it through the first challenge, and no one questioned his disguise. Even if they had, the real star was the cake itself. When the day's results were announced, Joseph's name was among those who advanced to the next round. Margaret's name was called too. They exchanged bright smiles across the kitchen. Lorraine clapped excitedly from the small audience section, tears of pride glistening in her eyes. That night, Joseph and Lorraine went out for a modest celebratory dinner. Seated in a cozy corner booth at a local diner, they sipped iced tea and shared stories about Joseph's childhood. Lorraine was in high spirits. "See, didn't I tell you that you had a gift? Not only that, you looked quite comfortable in your outfit." He blushed. "I'd be lying if I said I enjoyed wearing heels, but for some reason, once I start baking, I forget about them." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "You did wonderfully, my boy. Cynthia would be proud." The mention of his late wife brought both comfort and a quiet pang to Joseph's heart. He gazed at the half-eaten slice of pie in front of him. "It feels good to bake again," he admitted softly. "Like returning to a safe corner of my memory." Lorraine nodded. "And maybe as you keep going, you'll find something even more valuable." The words lingered in the air. Over the next few weeks, challenge after challenge tested the contestants' versatility. One round required them to produce fresh bread using only ancient grains. Another tasked them with constructing decorative pastries that showcased artistic flair. Joseph poured his heart into each challenge, often drawing upon the techniques he and Cynthia had honed in the past. Through it all, he refined his mannerisms as Josie, gradually easing into the role in front of the cameras and the judges. Margaret and Joseph grew friendlier, frequently exchanging tips and help. She discovered that her delicate kneading method worked wonders for biscuit dough, while Joseph revealed a trick for preventing fruit from sinking to the bottom of a cake batter. The casual camaraderie blossomed. They would sit together during breaks, sharing personal stories. Margaret spoke about her life, about how she had moved to this town 2 years prior following the loss of her husband. She had downsized from a bigger house to a simpler home closer to her adult son. She occasionally saw her grandchildren on weekends, but otherwise spent much of her time gardening and trying new recipes. Although Joseph never fully revealed his real identity, he opened up about losing someone close to him. He refrained from specifying he was talking about a wife, but Margaret's gentle expression told him she understood the weight of loss. They bonded over that shared experience of loving someone deeply and outliving them. One chilly afternoon, after a grueling round that involved making miniature tarts, Margaret approached Joseph in the hallway. They both carried their containers of leftover tarts, neatly stacked and ready to take home. Margaret hesitated, as though nervous, then cleared her throat. "Josie," she began softly, "would you like to grab coffee after next week's practice session? I found a nice little cafe near the library. It might be nice to chat outside of this stressful environment." Joseph felt a flutter of nerves in his stomach. Despite the predicament, posing as someone else, he appreciated the honesty in her eyes. "I'd love to," he said, voice slightly wavering with uncertainty. Margaret's face lit up. "Great, let's do it. Maybe it'll help us both unwind." They made their way out of the community center, parting ways in the parking lot. For a brief moment, Joseph felt guilty about the deception. He truly cherished the friendship building between them, but the entire premise was balanced on a lie. Nonetheless, the competition demanded that he maintain the illusion. As the weeks continued, the number of contestants dwindled. Joseph's unique flair and experience shone through in his dishes. Margaret also excelled, Her creations had a distinct homemade comfort that resonated with the judges. By the time they reached the final 5 contestants, Joseph felt a mix of pride and amazement. At the same time, the complexity of keeping up his disguise wore on him. He found himself exhausted from carefully modulating his voice, ensuring his wig remained in place, and worrying that a single slip might expose him. Yet the thrill of baking again outweighed those anxieties. With every challenge, he was reminded of the warmth he once shared in the kitchen, the memory of Cynthia guiding his hands. One day, he joined Margaret at the little cafe she had recommended. It was located on a quaint street lined with mature trees. A gentle wind ruffled the cloth awnings above shop windows. They found a table by the window, and the fragrance of fresh espresso hung in the air. Joseph felt slightly uneasy, wondering if any of the cafe patrons might look at him too closely, but no one seemed to care. They just saw 2 friends, both older individuals, likely meeting for a quiet chat. Margaret sipped her latte. "You know, when I first signed up for this competition, I thought I'd be out in the first round. I'm surprised I've made it this far." She gave a gentle laugh. "And I'm grateful I met you. You've been a wonderful confidant." Joseph smiled, remembering to keep his tone in the register he had been practicing. "I'm grateful too. It's comforting to have someone to talk to who understands loss." He paused, searching for words. "Before this competition, I was in a bit of a rut, and now I have a reason to get up in the morning to experiment with new recipes, to push myself." Margaret tilted her head. "You've been a lifeline for me. Believe it or not, my daughter-in-law suggested I find a new hobby after my husband's passing. She thought it might do me good to focus on something creative. I never imagined I'd wind up here, making complex pastries on camera." Joseph let out a soft chuckle. Life can certainly take unexpected turns. A companionable silence settled between them. Margaret reached across the table and placed a gentle hand over Joseph's. "I hope, once this competition is over, we can keep in touch. It's rare to find someone who truly listens." Joseph's stomach twisted with a mixture of warmth and guilt. He nodded. "I'd like that." They lingered for nearly an hour, discussing everything from the best way to store fresh herbs to their favorite childhood memories of home-cooked meals. When they finally parted ways, Joseph sat in his truck for a moment, the wig still pinned securely in place, and felt tears prick at his eyes. He realized that behind the persona of Josie, a real bond was forming. That week, the challenge was a complex one: to craft a signature dish that reflected a cherished memory. Each contestant would present the dish, share its story, and explain how it related to their life. Joseph hovered over his station, mind racing. He decided to make Cynthia's old favorite, a chocolate cake with whipped cream layers and fresh strawberries on top. It was the cake they had baked together for anniversaries. He spent hours perfecting each detail, sifting cocoa powder, carefully whipping the cream until it had the exact consistency, slicing the strawberries so that they fanned out elegantly. All the while, his mind drifted back to nights in the kitchen with Cynthia. They would share playful banter about who got to lick the spoon. He could almost see her smile. When the time came for him to introduce the dessert, he forced a calm expression, ignoring the flutter in his chest. "This is a special recipe," he said softly. "It represents the sweet connection I had with a loved one. Baking can be an expression of sharing something that once mattered a great deal." The judges tasted it, eyes lighting up at the chocolatey richness and bright tang of strawberries. They nodded, taking notes. Joseph wondered if they sensed any deeper meaning from his words. Margaret, standing at her own station, gave him an encouraging smile. As expected, Joseph advanced to the final 3, and Margaret was still in the running. The competition was drawing near its climax, but with that success came a realization. Soon, he would have to face a potential reveal or decide what to do if he won. He tried to keep his concerns at bay, but they kept creeping up late at night. One evening, while Joseph was double-checking a new bread recipe in Lorraine's kitchen, he heard her enter. She observed him kneading dough. "You look troubled, dear," Lorraine said gently. "Something on your mind?" He let out a long sigh, pausing his kneading. "Margaret. I like talking to her, but I feel terrible about lying. She's genuine, Grandma. A part of me fears she'll feel betrayed if she ever finds out about my disguise." Lorraine folded her arms. "You've grown fond of her, haven't you?" Joseph nodded, words catching in his throat. Lorraine approached him and put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "She strikes me as the sort of person who appreciates honesty and kindness. When the time is right, perhaps you can have a private conversation. It doesn't have to be now, but you can't carry this weight forever." He flexed his fingers in the dough. "I just don't want her to see me as a fraud." "She'll see your heart, Joseph," Lorraine said, voice soft. "That's more important than any disguise." Those words stayed with him as the final approached. The competition organizers had decided the last event would be a bake-off, done in front of a small live audience. The top 3 contestants would create their signature dessert while fielding questions from the host. Then, the judges would pick the winner. On the morning of the final, Joseph arrived at the community center feeling a mix of excitement and dread. The staff had turned the main hall into a vibrant stage, complete with bright lights, cameras, and seats for spectators. Joseph wore one of his simpler dresses, a navy blue garment with a small floral pattern, along with the bob wig that had become all too familiar. He touched the wig's edge, nerves pulsing in his stomach. He caught sight of Margaret, wearing a pale green apron. She was talking to another contestant and flashed Joseph a bright smile when she saw him. He returned it with a small wave, heart pounding for reasons that went beyond the competition. Lorraine stood in the front row, giving him a supportive nod. Once they were in position, the host introduced each finalist. Joseph felt a surge of adrenaline upon hearing Josie Hamilton. Applause rippled through the room. He knew some in the audience must have recognized him from the previous weeks. He steeled himself, forcing a steady smile as he stepped behind his station. Margaret went first. She prepared a layered fruit tart with impeccable precision. While she worked, the host asked her about her inspirations. She spoke lovingly of her late husband, describing how they used to experiment with pastries every Sunday morning. The audience listened intently, and the judges looked moved by the story. Then it was Joseph's turn. He had decided to make an elaborate Parisian-style croquembouche, cream puffs stacked into a tall tower, bound together with a delicate caramel drizzle. It was an advanced dessert, one he had never attempted in the competition before, but it was something he and Cynthia had admired in cookbooks. The host eyed his workstation with excitement. "That's quite a complex choice, Ms. Hamilton," the host remarked. "Where does your passion for such a challenging dessert come from?" Joseph's mind raced, carefully choosing his words. "It's something I studied a long time ago with someone who mattered deeply. It's a tribute to that memory." He pressed onward, piping pastry dough onto trays and sliding them into the oven. He prepared the pastry cream, carefully adjusting the sugar and vanilla. Time seemed to blur as each contestant poured all their skill into their final dessert. The hall filled with the aroma of sweet dough, chocolate, and caramel. Once Joseph's puffs were baked to a golden hue, he used a fine drizzle of caramel to stick them together, building the tower layer by layer. His hands trembled slightly, worried that one misstep might cause the entire creation to collapse. But his baking instincts guided him. The puffs held firm. When he completed the drizzle, he decorated the tower with small flowers made of spun sugar. Stepping back, he felt a surge of pride. The dessert glimmered under the stage lights, an edible testament to the craft he once shared with Cynthia. Margaret cast him an approving glance from her station. The final contestant unveiled an impressive multi-tiered cake with intricate piping. The judges would have a difficult choice ahead of them. In the last few minutes, the host moved down the row, asking each finalist one final question. When he reached Joseph, he asked, "If you win today, Ms. Hamilton, what do you plan to do next?" Joseph swallowed, glancing around at the faces watching him. He spotted Lorraine, eyes brimming with encouragement, and Margaret, whose expression was soft and full of curiosity. The desire to reveal his truth surged within him, but he hesitated. This was a public stage, not the place for revelations that might overshadow everything else. He mustered a poised answer. "I'd be grateful for the opportunity to continue baking, perhaps share what I've learned with others. Baking can bring people together in a very special way." The host nodded, seemingly satisfied, and let the timer run out. At the sound of a bell, the contestants stepped back from their stations. The tension in the air was palpable as the three judges approached each final creation. They took pictures, sampled portions, and whispered among themselves. Joseph waited, heart pounding, as the panel huddled on stage. Finally, one of the judges stepped forward to announce the results. "After much deliberation, we've decided that the winner of the Culinary Stars Showcase is..." She paused, scanning the three finalists. "Josie Hamilton!" Applause broke out. Joseph stared in disbelief as a wave of euphoria and relief spread through him. Margaret clapped enthusiastically, tears bright in her eyes. The host ushered Joseph forward, awarding him a trophy shaped like a whisk and presenting him with a bouquet of flowers. Joseph forced himself to focus, mindful that the cameras were still rolling. "Congratulations!" the host exclaimed. "How does it feel to be our champion?" Joseph held the trophy. For a moment, he could see Cynthia in his mind's eye, smiling in that approving way she had whenever he tested a new recipe. His throat tightened. "It feels incredible," he said quietly, voice echoing through the microphone. "This has been a journey that means more than I can express." His gaze flicked to Lorraine, who was beaming, and then to Margaret, who offered him a gracious thumbs up. The competition concluded with photos, handshakes, and cheers. Soon, the crowds dispersed, the cameras were packed away, and the bright stage lights dimmed. Joseph found a corner where he removed the microphone pinned to his blouse. Margaret walked up beside him, her expression full of warmth. "Congratulations," she said, sincerity in her tone. "Your dessert was breathtaking. I'm so happy for you." Joseph murmured thanks, cradling the trophy in both hands. "Margaret, I appreciate your kindness more than you know." She hesitated, eyes drifting over him. "I hope we can celebrate together. Maybe we can meet again this week, talk about what's next for both of us." That swirl of guilt rose again. He knew he needed to talk to her, privately and honestly. "I'd like that. Could we meet tomorrow morning at the little park near the library?" Her eyes sparkled. "Yes, I'll be there at 10. He nodded, noticing Lorraine waving at him from across the hall. "I'll see you then." As Margaret walked away, Joseph quietly promised himself that he would finally reveal the truth of who he was. He owed her that much. Early the next day, Joseph dressed in his usual casual attire, khakis and a simple collared shirt, leaving the wig and women's clothes behind. He felt odd without them, given how much time he had spent in that disguise during the competition. But he knew this conversation couldn't happen as Josie. He arrived at the park 15 minutes early, finding a secluded bench by a pond. Ducks waddled along the water's edge, and a few joggers weaved past. Joseph sat there, the crisp morning air touching his skin. He gripped the trophy he'd brought with him, feeling his heart pound in his chest. He spotted Margaret approaching along the path. She wore a light jacket and a curious expression, likely expecting to see Josie. When she caught sight of Joseph, she slowed her pace, confusion clouding her features. Carefully, she walked up to him. "Excuse me," she said, a cautious tone in her voice. "Have we met? You look familiar." Joseph stood, clutching the trophy. "Margaret, it's me, Josie." She blinked, and her eyes darted to the trophy he was holding. Recognition flickered on her face. Her posture stiffened. "What do you mean?" He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his short hair. "I'm Joseph, the real name behind Josie Hamilton. I disguised myself to enter the competition." Her mouth fell slightly open. "You..." She paused, swallowing hard. "You mean the friend I've been talking to for weeks? Was you all along?" Joseph nodded, feeling an ache in his chest. "Yes, I'm not a woman, obviously. I'm a widower, 62 years old. My grandmother wanted me to join the competition, but we feared it would be harder for me to enter or be noticed as an older man. She thought it'd be best if I competed as Josie. At first it was ridiculous, but then, well, I started remembering how much I love baking, and then I met you. I never planned to deceive you or anyone else." Margaret took a small step back, her hands trembling. "All those conversations we had. You listened to me talk about my husband, my grief, and you told me about your own loss. I felt a real bond. That was all true?" Joseph's throat constricted. "Everything I said about losing someone close was true. I lost my wife, Cynthia, 5 years ago. I just didn't tell you the part about who I really am. You have every right to be upset." Margaret pressed her lips together, tears forming in her eyes. "I don't know how to react. I appreciated your warmth, your advice, your empathy. But this is such a shock." He gently placed the trophy on the bench, taking a tentative step forward. "Please believe me when I say I never wanted to hurt you. The entire scheme was my grandmother's idea, but I went along with it willingly. Once we started talking, it became about more than just a contest. I genuinely cared about you and your story." She closed her eyes, fighting back emotions. "I feel confused. I won't lie. It's like part of me wants to walk away, but another part remembers how kind you were." Joseph nodded, hands shaking. "I'm asking for your understanding, even if you can't forgive me yet. I just wanted to explain." Margaret rubbed her eyes, taking a few deep breaths. She turned to look at the pond, the ducks floating serenely, unaware of the turmoil on the shore. "You remind me a little of my husband. He would do anything to keep the people he loved safe and happy. Maybe that's what you were trying to do, for your grandmother, for yourself, for some reason only you fully know. I'm not going to judge that right this instant." He moved closer, his voice soft. "Thank you for hearing me out." She finally faced him again, tears drying on her cheeks. "I won't pretend this is easy, but I'll tell you this. You were a true friend when I needed one, even if it was in disguise. I can't just throw that away. Give me time to process this, all right?" Joseph nodded, exhaling in relief. "Take all the time you need." The two stood quietly for a moment, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Then Margaret gave him a cautious smile. "I hope you'll at least keep baking. You have a gift." A soft laugh escaped him. "I will. It's a piece of me I can't ignore any longer." They parted ways, an uncertain but hopeful note lingering between them. Joseph felt lighter, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted. Lorraine's scheme had turned his world upside down, but it had also reignited his passion and sparked an important connection. Margaret hadn't promised anything, but she hadn't rejected him outright. Over the next several days, Joseph went about his life without the wig or the dresses. He packed them away neatly, unsure if he'd ever need them again. The trophy from the competition sat on his kitchen countertop. Each morning, he took a moment to look at it before measuring out flour or mixing up a batch of dough. He felt stronger, steadier, and more eager to embrace each new day. Lorraine visited him one afternoon, beaming with pride. She walked through the door, immediately noticing the trophy. "Well, look at that. My grandson, the champion," she said with a broad grin. Joseph laughed, pouring her a cup of tea. "You and your wild ideas. Turns out you might have known what you were doing." She accepted the teacup and sipped delicately. "Did you speak to Margaret?" His gaze drifted to the window. "Yes, I did. She was shocked and hurt, but she heard me out. I think she's willing to keep the lines of communication open." Lorraine patted his shoulder. "Then that's a good sign. I'm proud of you for telling her the truth." He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. It felt like the right thing to do. Days slipped into weeks, and Margaret was often on Joseph's mind. He avoided pressuring her, giving her space. Then, one Sunday morning, he found a note slipped under his front door. It read, "I've been thinking about everything. If you're free, I'd like to meet for coffee again. Let me know. Margaret." She had left her phone number at the bottom. Joseph's heart soared. He immediately called, and they arranged to meet at the same cafe. When they sat down across from each other at a small table by the window, the conversation felt cautious at first. But slowly they began talking about the competition, about the pastries Margaret had been trying at home, about the local produce that was coming into season. Eventually, Margaret leaned forward. "I want to say this up front. I don't condone deception, but I also recognize that we live in a world that can push people to do all sorts of peculiar things for a second chance. You and I are both older. We know how precious time is." Joseph nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. "I regret the lie, but not the bond we formed. It's one of the best things that's happened to me in a very long time." She folded her hands around her coffee mug. "I won't pretend it'll be easy to trust you the same way immediately, but I'm willing to see where our friendship can go. We shared something real when we talked about our loved ones. That part wasn't a costume." His eyes misted over, but he held it together. "Thank you. I'll be honest with you from now on. Whatever you want to know, just ask." Margaret offered a tender smile. "Okay." From there, they navigated a cautious but genuine friendship. Sometimes they met to discuss recipes. Other times they chatted about their lives before moving to this town, or they strolled through the local farmers market. Each step felt like a careful dance, a new layer of trust forming, shaped by the sincerity Joseph now displayed without a disguise. Meanwhile, Joseph found renewed enthusiasm in his kitchen. The spark he once felt with Cynthia now fluttered in him whenever he tried new pastries or experimented with different flours. Lorraine dropped by regularly, and together they would test fresh produce, dreaming up possibilities for a future bakery. Although Joseph hadn't taken steps to open one yet, the idea no longer seemed impossible. He and Margaret remained in close contact. Their conversations moved beyond sorrowful memories, delving into fresh topics. She confided in him about her desire to volunteer with a local community center, teaching basic cooking skills to seniors who lived alone. He offered to help. The idea of passing on their baking knowledge to others felt meaningful. One afternoon, they both found themselves at the community center in a modest kitchen that smelled faintly of stale coffee. About a dozen older folks gathered around, eager to learn how to bake simple bread. Margaret demonstrated how to mix yeast into warm water without killing it, while Joseph joked about his early disasters back when he first tried bread making. The class participants laughed along with them, asking plenty of questions. Later, as they cleaned up, Margaret caught Joseph's gaze. There was a moment of quiet understanding. They had found a way to channel their experiences, both the pain of losing loved ones and the joys of culinary creativity, into something that brought happiness to others. Neither of them had planned for this to be part of their story, but it was happening, and it was beautiful in its simplicity. Finally, one evening, after a busy day helping at the center, they went for a walk together. The setting sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. They paused by a rose bush in full bloom, the sweet scent drifting in the twilight air. Margaret turned to Joseph, her expression gentle but steady. "You know," she said quietly, "I was thinking about how far we've come since that baking contest. You won the trophy, but I feel like I won something too. A friend who understands what it means to keep going after losing someone." Joseph felt emotion tighten in his chest. "I'm grateful for that, more than I can put into words." She gently laid a hand on his forearm. "At my age, I don't want to waste time holding grudges. I'd rather hold on to the good that's right in front of me. And you are good, Joseph, even if your path here was complicated." He touched her hand in return, offering a faint, warm smile. "Life throws unexpected things at us. I'd like to continue walking through whatever comes next, with you." Margaret's eyes reflected a touch of joy. "I'd like that too." They wandered on, side by side, two people who had faced heartbreak and now found a measure of hope. They weren't rushing into anything, but they weren't running away either. At home, Joseph carefully put the finishing touches on a new recipe for a lemon bundt cake. As it cooled, he thought about the path that had led him here, the cross-dressing scheme that initially made him cringe, the anxiety of being exposed, the quiet moments of companionship with Margaret. Even if it began with a disguise, it had propelled him toward a brighter chapter than he had ever thought possible. He remembered Cynthia's face, imagining she was looking down on him with approval. When he finally sliced a piece of the cake, the aroma and tangy flavor brought a smile to his lips. He felt the hope that tomorrow would bring something sweet and perhaps something challenging too. Either way, he was ready to face it. He had a cherished baking trophy on his counter, a grandmother who believed in him, and a friend, maybe something more, who stood by him despite the unusual start. He realized, with a quiet sense of wonder, that sometimes the most unexpected plans can lead us to discover joys hidden under layers of sorrow. And while he could never bring back Cynthia, he could honor the love they once shared by embracing what lay ahead with open arms. There was still flour to sift, ovens to preheat, and brand new recipes to explore. And in sharing those creations, both with his grandmother and with Margaret, he found a life that felt real, grounded, and worth living every single day.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.